Hello, hello. I hope you're doing well. We're here in the room, and today we'll be discussing John Williams's Stoner. John Williams was an American writer active in the mid 20th century. He wrote a handful of novels: Stoner, Butcher's Crossing, which I'm currently reading, as well as Augustus, which won the National Book Award. William Stoner entered the University of Missouri as a freshman in the year 1910, at the age of 19. 8 years later, during the height of World War I, he received his Doctor of Philosophy degree and accepted an instructorship at the same university where he taught until his death in 1956. He did not rise above the rank of assistant professor, and few students remembered him with any sharpness after they had taken his courses. When he died, his colleagues made a memorial contribution of a medieval manuscript to the university library. This manuscript may still be found in the Rare Books collection, bearing the inscription, "Presented to the Library of the University of Missouri, in memory of William Stoner, Department of English, by his colleagues." That's the opening paragraph of Williams's Stoner, and it really does set the tone for the novel. It's very simple, very subtle, a little bit inauspicious. It paints a life that perhaps didn't really go to plan. And we do get a sense of that in the novel. However, we also get a much richer insight into Stoner's life. And once the novel ends, this narrative of having an unfulfilled, perhaps inauspicious life does get turned on its head, and it gets challenged a bit. And it does go with the theme of appearances. It may appear that William Stoner had just a simple life that perhaps didn't go too far. He wasn't remembered too well. But for himself, his life actually was quite vivid and quite beautiful. And he found love in his life. He found this process of love. A little more on that later. So William Stoner came from rural upbringings in Missouri. He worked on his family's farm. He toiled the earth, worked long hours as a young adult there. He was fully immersed in that rural life, and he gained the opportunity to go to university, to go to college. And he took that opportunity. And the college was going to be, he was studying agriculture. And initially he demonstrates a sort of, he doesn't seem to belong in the university. He walks around the perimeters of its walls before fully emerging in the university. And he studies for the first year agriculture, which is what he would set out to study, and it's what his family wanted him to study. However, he finds love in English literature. He takes an English literature class under the teacher Sloan, Professor Sloan, and this professor very much inspires Stoner and sort of touches something ungraspable for him, and a bit it seems almost ephemeral, something fleeting but beautiful. He touches for Sloan, and it's there that he gets roused. This love, this experience of love, he starts to feel it. Love throughout the novel is not described as much as just a feeling, but for the most part a process. something in which we start to find ourselves, start to realize things about ourselves. Eventually, he starts to find haven in university, in academia. And the intangibilities, he sort of starts to create a private life for himself in academia and in immersing himself in English literature. So his second academic year, he changes into English literature, and he starts to pursue that as his major. And he becomes an English professor eventually. He attains his doctorate degree. And all throughout this process, he is having to work during his undergrad. He's having to work on a farm. He's having to really, for the most part, suffer. To pay for his rent, he's having to do these jobs, toil the earth and continue that process. But he still finds this beautiful repose in literature and studying literature. And it doesn't ever seem like something arduous for him, this immersion into literature. Eventually, he ends up marrying a woman, Edith. However, their marriage is not a fulfilling one. She is quite neurotic. Stoner himself is quite stoic, and he embodies very much this archetype of the quiet man. I'm going to bring Emerson into this. Although Emerson never explicitly spoke about the quiet man, this man that works his job and he sort of finds beauty in his own work and purpose and meaning in his work. Emerson never really explicitly mentions that, but there is something in Ralph Waldo Emerson's writing that creeps up in John Williams's Stoner, and as well I feel in Butcher's Crossing, this sense of trying to find oneself through perhaps work. For the most part, it's much more through nature in Emerson, but we can also find ourselves in work. It's like the quote by Joseph Conrad. It goes, I'm maybe butchering the quote a bit, but it goes to me, if I recall, it's, no one can really know what the meaning of work is, but we find ourselves in this action. No one can ever know exactly what it means, but it's our own solace. It's something to that effect that I recall Joseph Conrad had a quote. There was a passage in, I believe it was Heart of Darkness, that talks about work as a place in which we find ourselves. And you do get that through Stoner. Edith, on the contrary, very much struggles in finding a purpose in her life. She's kind of fluttering between different vocations and different hobbies. She's trying to constantly reimagine herself and change into something different before reverting back, and there's a real sense of restlessness within her, whereas Stoner seems to be much more stoic, solid, tied to the ground, perhaps because of his rural upbringing. Edith comes from a very wealthy family, a family that made a lot of money through the financial system, and her own father, he ends up committing suicide because of the financial crisis, the onset of the Great Depression, when many banks had to foreclose. Whereas Stoner's parents continued to work on the farm. There is a sense that Stoner kind of abandoned his parents, and there is a subtle sense of regret that you get from him at that part of the novel. His parents very much wanted him, and they anticipated that he was going to study agriculture in order to transform the farm. And although he would go back and help them with the farm during summers, it seemed quite clear that he was more interested in pursuing a career as an academic in English literature. However, still, this upbringing, this rural upbringing, does give him a sort of foundation, a very solid sense of himself. And it's interesting that he himself seems quite tied, quite sure of himself. He doesn't doubt himself often in this story. And sometimes it does reach a point where it does seem like perhaps he has some blind spots because of his assuredness of himself, because of his assuredness of situations and how things are. It does seem perhaps like he perhaps is a little bit too rigid. There's a point where I thought that might be the case, but it never feels too negative, like he is, can I say it, discriminatory or not understanding of other people. I mention this because there is a disagreement that arises between Stoner and another academic as to a certain graduate student that seems all pomp and luster, but doesn't really have the knowledge of English literature. This is in an oral examination in order to basically, as the process to becoming a doctor in philosophy. To get a PhD, students have to take an oral examination. And this student seemed to be much more verbose, much more polished in his words, however, not very knowledgeable about English literature itself, and didn't seem to have a love for English literature. Once again, it's that theme of love and finding havens in university that seems to constantly prop up in this story. The writing is quite simple but beautiful. It's really quite masterful prose, I would say. It never tries to shine too much or be too pompous. However, in its subtlety, in its simplicity, Stoner really becomes a beautiful story about finding oneself through one's work, relying in oneself, and being in love until your last breath. And that love doesn't have to be with other people necessarily. It can be just a feeling. It can be a feeling that can transmit with other people, to other people, between things, between ideas. So, as in, to quote the passage in which Stoner's recalling is the speech, the class that Sloan gave, which was his mentor, who really inspired him to take up English literature. Passage reads, "And he would feel that he was out of time, as he had felt that day in class when Archer Sloan had spoken to him. The past gathered out of the darkness where it stayed, and the dead raised themselves to live before him, and the past and the dead flowed into the present among the alive, so that he had, for an instant, intense instant, a vision of denseness, into which he was compacted, and from which he could not escape, and had no wish to escape. Tristan, Iseult the fair, walked before him. Paolo and Francesca whirled in the glowing dark. Helen and bright Paris, their faces bitter with consequence, rose from the gloom." There are two world wars that happen in this story, World War I and World War II. World War I happens when Stoner is a graduate student, and many of the students end up being a part of the war effort. However, Stoner makes the decision to not do that, to not go into the war, not enlist. And you see the repercussions of him not enlisting. He is passed off for certain opportunities, whereas other students who survive the war and come back, they're treated like heroes, and they are given more opportunities even if they're not as talented as Stoner was. However, Stoner doesn't pass up on the war through a feeling of cowardice, but rather through a feeling of love, that it is really English literature that he's tied to and paired to. He seems kind of ambivalent to the war itself. And World War II happens, and Stoner is also, at this point, he's a professor, and he sees once again the effects that it's having on the campus. It's making it much more emptier, much more drearier place. It's at this point where he really starts to go into himself much more. He starts to write much more feverishly at this point. Appearances are quite important in the novel as well. Edith, Stoner's wife, puts a lot of stock in appearances, especially for their daughter, Grace, who comes into the world. She wants Grace to be a certain way. It's at this that we can see how individuals affect each other. That when we are an individual as ourselves, we're constantly in a process of becoming. However, younger people, infants, children, it's much easier for them to get affected by others. This is quite true. And we see that through Grace. And Stoner tries himself to affect her in a certain way. But Edith is not having it. She would much rather have Grace, their daughter, be a traditional girl rather than kindle that studious side of her that Stoner wishes to nurture. Yeah. So, Stoner, quite a beautiful novel by John Williams. I highly recommend it. It's one that's not too long. It doesn't seem incredibly exciting, but in its subtlety, in how mundane it might seem on the surface, though, it is such a beautiful story about just a man and his life and this process of him becoming a person and discovering things about himself through English literature. Very much this is a love letter to literature, I would say. A love letter to individuality and finding yourself, not being too influenced by the ebbs and flows of society, if one can do that. But that's what I'm going to say for Stoner. A beautiful novel. Hope you enjoyed. Take care.